Started 7 a.m. already, 7 p.m. already. Ma'am, your audio is muted.
Please start, I said. It's 7.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Good evening and thank you so much for joining us tonight. On behalf of International School for Sri Shankaracharya Studies, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all dignitaries, guests and delegates present here for the International Lecture Series on Teacher, Text and Tradition, Indian Philosophical Heritage. I'm also glad to invite everyone to the website launching ceremony of this international school. We hope you will find the program to be fruitful and engaging. I'm sure it is going to be a great honor, a great hour of interaction and learning for all of us. Let me now invite Shrikala N. Nair, Director, International School of Shankaracharya Studies, to speak.
Thank you, Anusha. Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Dharmaraj Ajaj, and other friends of mine. Let me start with an invocation as the practices. Vidita Khila Shastra Sudha Janane Mahitopanishad Kabhedardhanidhe Hridayi Kamale Vimalam Charanam Bhava Shankara Deshika Me Sharanam Bhava Shankara Deshika Me Sharanam Bhava Shankara Deshika Me Sharanam. Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Dharmaraj Ajaj, revered Swamiji, Swami Sri Hari Prasad, the speaker of the day, Professor Anand, Vaidya. I have seen Professor Rakesh Chandra of Lucknow University, the chair of today's academic event, Dr. Sukanya Anand Krishna, and other colleagues of mine and dear students and scholars. Good evening to all of you and welcome to this beautiful evening. As you all know that this evening we are going to launch 2 significant programs of International School for Sri Shankara Studies. That is a separate website, an independent website for the school and also an international lecture series with the title Teacher, Text and the Tradition, Indian Philosophical Heritage. To speak very briefly on the activities of International School of Sri Shankara Studies, I suppose barring Swamiji, the rest of them have all probably have heard of it. So I'll be very, very brief, just take 2 or 3 minutes for it. So this school is primarily been instituted to produce and disseminate knowledge in Advaita Vedānta particularly, and also the neighboring streams of philosophical schools like Viśiṣṭādvaita, Dvaita, Madhyamaka, all these transcendental schools, and also other Indian systems of philosophy, be it Nyaya or Mimamsa, all these systems. And why even other idealistic streams of philosophy, be it that of Berkeley or Hegel, would also be equally significant as well as International School of Sri Shankara Studies is concerned. We have already successfully been undertaking a study circle called Sri Shankara Study Circle. I'm so happy about it because this is a long dream of mine to pick up the text and read it, give the English rendition of it and then discuss it. which I could implement through this forum. And I'm indeed grateful to Honorable Vice Chancellor for having given this opportunity to make the young, also the old. Recently, I heard Professor Arindam Chakravarti, and he was repeatedly asking me for the text. And I realized that I keep forgetting the major texts, the major sutras. So it's very, very significant that we old people also should read the text and keep reminding ourselves about the textual tradition. We also have projects, small projects, and we also aim at conducting Vidvat Sabhas, the Prachina way of debating, the debate forums, as we call it, which is done in Sanskrit. Those who have participated in our study circle would have seen that all the scholarly discussions are mostly in Sanskrit, because, and I'm extremely happy that the ancient scholarship, the tradition of scholarship has been revived through the school, and if the school could be a platform for this, we are very happy about it. And we plan to do actually credit courses for students from foreign universities, which is yet to be started, and also short-term courses on familiarizing with Vedānta tradition, which we are already doing for the public at large. These days Indian philosophy is every man's trade, so much so that everybody lay their hands on Indian philosophy. So to get an authoritative information about Indian philosophy is hard, and the school takes it upon itself as one of its tasks to give genuine authoritative information on Vedanta tradition or any Indian philosophical school to the public through the medium of regional languages. And with regard to the programs in pipeline, the major one is a research journal. As all of you know that committing a research journal is very easy, but then carrying it, continuing it is the hardest one. So we'll have to think several times, not once or twice, before you commit that. So we have been seriously thinking. There is yet another reason. Let me share, since most of the crowd here happen to be my friend folk. Some 2-3 years back, I did not know how many of you do know Professor Rajendra Prasad. He is 95, 96 now. He's one of the senior most living philosophers in India. So when I was organizing a seminar in Lucknow Center, he was there. He was there to address the valedictory session or something. He held my hand and then said, Shrikala, you should start a research journal. And I was hesitant because I knew the trouble behind it. And then I said, sir, but and then he said, no, philosophers are stingy. They'll never buy books. So if you want to disseminate scholarship, then you will have to have a research journal. And I tried we are trying, Swamiji and myself, we are working out to revive Jnanagni, which I presume with God's grace and Sadhguru's grace will materialize soon. But this research journal, as Professor Rajendra Prasad said, is very, very significant, because only through journals that we can disseminate knowledge and keep the debate on in emerging issues in philosophy. So friends, these are the major activities that we do and we plan to do from this platform. So now, why a separate website for ISSs? Because, Shankaracharya University is majorly an educational institution, and only the young and those who want to get trained are likely to visit Shankaracharya website. But then our goals are pretty different, and we aim at senior scholars. Those who have great scholarship in the established scholarship in these schools, and therefore we thought that we need to have a separate website, which is getting materialized with the great cooperation of our Honorable Vice Chancellor. In this, with regard to the lecture series, which we are initiating today, the teacher text and the tradition, as we call it, the T trio. As you all know, this is a scholarly community. I don't have to instruct. But then you all know that below the Vindhyan ranges, what we call the southern region, which is a land full of culture and tradition, has gave birth to those Vedantic tradition, streams of Vedantas were born and nurtured here. And all these were maintained here through the hermeneutic, the method of hermeneutic, where the teacher, text, and the tradition were interlinked. As you all know, the text, remains as, the full coconut, without, with which you can't do anything. If it remains as a full coconut, you will have to break it. And how will you break it? Only with the aid of a teacher. And teacher and the text together go to make the tradition. And again, it is not an one-way help, a one-way support. Without the tradition, the teacher finds him nowhere. So the teacher first will have to place himself within the tradition and only take the text along to the tradition. So this is a chain interlinked. And I was requesting scholars across the globe to take up philosophers and texts, and also link it and place it within the tradition that they were supposed to be coming up with. So here we have none other than Honorable Vice Chancellor Professor Rāmānuja to inaugurate both these, to launch both these schemes, innovative schemes that we are coming up with today. As probably majority of you might not know that Professor Rāmānuja would leave the chair very soon, probably in another 1 week. He will leave the Vice Chancellorship. As everyone knows, in the university, within the university fraternity, ISS, the school has received immense support from him to take this, to take the projects ahead. And he is a friend of mine. It is wonderful to have a friend in the Vice Chancellor's chair, and I'll miss him once he steps down, particularly if I have to take the projects for ISS to Vice Chancellor. On behalf of the whole community traveled here, I welcome you, sir, with great reverence and respect to this platform. This evening we have Anand Vaidya, who is an established scholar. I've met him in several platforms, and the oration that he has is wonderful, very deep knowledge. And what most of us don't have in India is that we don't get across our peers outside India, which Anand has. So whatever that you communicate to Anand, it also parallelly reaches across the globe. So that way, if you have to tell anything to the global community, you can tell Anand, because he has, the connections, well-established connections within the fraternity. He has already presented a paper in this forum. Once again, I welcome Professor Anand Vaidya, Professor of San Jose State University, to this platform to deliver this inaugural, the very first lecture in this series. And we also have Dr. Sukanya. I have seen her several times making presentations. And a young scholar, very committed, and who has a tendency to dive deep into the topic. And then once I had asked Swamiji, can you have Suganya's mail ID? And he was very kind to pass it on to me and shared you have Suganya, who is basically working in manuscriptology, I suppose. But then she's a great scholar in Viśiṣṭādvaita tradition. And therefore, it's wonderful to have Suganya as a chair for this session. And she is from University of Hamburg, Germany, but currently working in Pondicherry, taking up the projects that she has committed in Germany. So I also welcome Suganya to this platform. So we have Swamiji, who has kindly agreed to be with us. We really look forward, Swamiji, for your comments and support. Primarily blessings. So please do join us whenever time permits. I know that you are very, very busy, of course, health issues and all of that. But nevertheless, we need your support. And I welcome you, Swamiji, to this platform. And Professor Rakesh Chandra, I really do not have a small screen. Professor Ramakrishna Bhatt, I see several senior professors here who have joined us. I welcome all of you, and then presume that we will receive continued cooperation from this academic fraternity. I mean, thank you all.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the beautiful welcome address and the speech that everything made clear. Now, let me have the honor to invite Professor Dharmaraj Adat, our beloved Vice Chancellor, to inaugurate the session of International Lecture Series and also to inaugurate our new website. Sir.
Good evening to everybody. The chief speaker of the day, Professor Anand Vaidya, the moderator, Dr. Sukanya, Professor Srikala M. Nair, Director of the International School for Sri Shankara Studies, and other distinguished academics who have assembled virtually, and my dear students. Today, the International School for Sri Shankara Studies is making yet another step in its onward journey by inaugurating its new website and initiating an international lecture series on teacher, text, and the tradition, Indian philosophical heritage. I am happy to note that International Sri Shankara Studies School is getting to its track, working hard towards converting this school a center for Vedantic learning. I wish them all the very best. Friends, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit as an institution meant for Sanskrit and Indic learning has by now begun to get the attention of scholars across the country. Its uniqueness consists in actively engaging interdisciplinary and intradisciplinary exercises among the disciplines and thereby promotes and contextualize Sanskrit studies. As we all know, majority of India's intellectual heritage lie in the Sanskrit tradition, which for several reasons remained stagnant and unavailable for the majority of our countrymen. This university has taken up the huge task of making Sanskrit scholarship socially available and contemporaneous by imbibing the virtues of modernity from other disciplines and enrich them in turn with its conceptual depth. This crisis crossing intellectual transaction among the disciplines might have made this institution significantly different from other institutions meant to promote Sanskrit. During my reign as Vice Chancellor of this university, I am happy that we could achieve several things that made the flag of our university fly high, including the NAC A+ grade we received recently. Among the programs and innovations we did during this period, restructuring of international Sri Shankara studies goal holds a significant place. I am happy that the present directorate has taken the task entrusted upon them seriously and have already made a mark in the academic world with their activities. Good participation of scholars across the world in their programs attest this. The new website which we would inaugurate today will help them to have an easier reach to centers of Sanskrit studies across the globe and help them to take their academic initiatives to their global peer community and thereby procure larger involvement. I am also happy to learn that the school is initiating a new international lecture series with the theme Teacher, Text and the Tradition, Indian Philosophical Heritage. Presumably, what they have in mind is to unfold the hermeneutics by which Vedanta schools have taken them ahead. I suggest that they should encourage the young minds to participate in such feats and help them find themselves within the text and the tradition. This is exactly what is needed to promote Indian philosophy. Sri Shankara Study Circle, that International Sri Shankara Studies Center has launched earlier, that undertake text reading and interpretation is equally beneficial. I wish that the present leadership may continue to take the school to its new heights and thereby promote Advaita studies. With great pride and happiness, I declare the new website as well as the international lecture series open. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your very thought-provoking and interesting inaugural address. The inauguration gave us an opportunity to come together as a community and to celebrate hope for the future. Hope is a powerful driver. My deepest wish is that we act on this hope together and inspire positive and important advancements for RE. Now let me have the pleasure to share the website page now being inaugurated by our Honorable Vice Chancellor. I request to share the website page. Is there any net problem?
Can the expert please speak? Is there any net problem? Anyway, we have had a small vision of it, and then if you pass on the ID, website ID, then probably they can look for themselves. And shall we move ahead? Can the
Okay, ma'am.
people at the other end speak, or do they want to still try? ISSS? Uh, oh, this is the website. This is the site ID. Okay. Okay. Probably you can move ahead, Anusha.
Okay. Okay, thank you, ma'am. Now let me invite Dr. Suganya Ananda, Center for Studies of Manuscript Culture, University of Hamburg, Germany, to moderate the session and to talk a few words about today's theme. Over to you, ma'am.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm very honored to be here today. Thank you, Sri Kalaji, for inviting me to chair the session and say a few words. As a scholar who works on the Viśiṣṭādvaitic texts by Rāmānuja's successors, mainly in Tamil and Manipravala, I thought that perhaps I could introduce Rāmānuja and his philosophy very, very briefly in the hopes that it will serve the talk well, insofar as it will give the audience background information that isn't redundant to the talk, especially since I don't exactly know what topics Professor Vaidya will be dealing with in his talk. There might be, of course, overlaps and or contradictions, but these will surely make for a lively discussion at the end. Okay, now let me say a few words on Rāmānujacārya. Most of us, all of us, I should say, know Rāmānujacārya, and I think that everyone would acknowledge him as a most important figure of the second millennium, perhaps even of all times. And he is one of the most influential thinkers of our times, who has influenced very deeply, among other things, all the Vaishnava sampradayas that exist now, Nimbarka, Gaudiya, etc., you name it. And in that sense, he has influenced modern day Hinduism itself, especially popular Hindu practice. And most of what we know, despite all this, most of what we know about Rāmānuja comes from Sri Vaishnava hagiographies, but also from other Sri Vaishnava writings like commentaries. He was born, or believed to have been born, in the 11th century, and Rāmānuja initially studied under Jayaprakash, a well-known figure himself, whose form of Vedānta had strong affinities with Shankara's Advaita, and it was also close to Bheda philosophy. But Rāmānuja was not satisfied with his teacher's interpretations of some of the Upanishadic passages that Rāmānuja himself preferred to interpret from a theistic point of view. So Rāmānuja left him. And later on, he was instructed, according to the traditions, by 5 disciples of Yamunacharya. Now, Yamunacharya, who lived in the 10th century, led a small set of Vishnu worshippers who based his philosophy on the Vedas, of course, but also on the Tamil Vedas, meaning the Nalaira Divya Prabandham, meaning the poetry of the Arvas, as well as the Pancharatra Agamas. Now, the traditions also hold that Rāmānuja learned all the Sampradayarthas, including the mantras, but also the Upanishads and the Ramayana, known as the Sharanagati Shastra within the Sampradaya, as well as the Divya Prabandham, from these 5 teachers, which perhaps explains Rāmānuja's philosophy to a great extent. And it was Rāmānuja who will disseminate the philosophy of this modest little group of Sri Vaishnavas, who were initially headed by Nathamuni, the 10th century rather, and then by his grandson, Yamunacharya, whom I just mentioned. And how did he do that? By properly articulating their philosophy, and of course his own also, because he did modify some of the points. And he articulated this philosophy to an academic community that was pan-Indian in nature. And this Rāmānuja did mainly through traveling across the land and engaging in debates with people from other belief systems, whom he eventually is said to have converted and turned into his own disciples. But he also did that through composing works. As he wrote, like all the major Vedantins, like Shankaracharya before him and Madhvacharya after him, first of all, of great importance, it's not a chronological list, a commentary on the Brahma Sutra. So as you all know, a set of sutras that summarize the philosophical meanings of the Upanishads attributed to Badarayana. And Rāmānuja's commentary is simply known as the Sri Bhashyam. He also wrote a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita and one on the Upanishads. Actually, it's not quite a commentary because it's not a fully fledged commentary on the Upanishads, but rather a work that summarizes their meanings. It's known as the Vedartha Sangraham. So other than these three major works, 6 other works are attributed to him and contested by scholars for various reasons, which we won't get into today. 2 works that summarize his own Sri Bhashyam, the Vedanta Saram and the Vedanta Deepa, but also three Gadyas, Sharanagati, Sriranga, and Vaikuntha Gadyas, which are actually prose hymns collectively known as the Gadyatraya, whose theory concerning bhakti, Sharanagati, etc., is slightly at variance with his views presented in the Sri Bhashyam, for example, which is why people think that he didn't write it, but that's only a minority of scholars, and I won't get into that either. And finally, he has also composed, or at least we attribute the Nitya Grantha to him. It's a manual of daily worship for the Sri Vaishnavas. So Rāmānuja's philosophy, as expressed in his 3 major works that I just mentioned, establishes the existence of three tattvas, as you all know, I'm sure. I'm just repeating things that you already know. Chit, which refers to the sentient entities, Achit, which refers to the insentient entities, and Ishvara, God. And his philosophy can be said to be theistic in nature, as it affirms a God with qualities who is morally perfect and who is also omniscient and omnipotent. And it can also be described as being realistic in that it states the existence and the reality of a plurality of qualities, persons, and objects, to quote Shyam Ranganathan. So the main points of contention among the different schools of Vedanta, like Advaita, Bheda, and even Dvaita, we just need to remember that Dvaita existed before Madhva, probably under a different appellation. So the main points of contention rise from their understanding, for example, of the nature as well as the ontological status of the individual souls, but also from the objects of cognition and Brahman, and of the importance of dharma, for example, to the good life. I won't get into that either, just giving you some ideas. Of course, there's much more to Rāmānuja's philosophy. Anyway, Rāmānuja's philosophy was later known as Viśiṣṭādvaita, as you all know, and it's often translated as qualified non-dualism, but also, more interestingly, as non-duality of the qualified whole, or even non-duality with qualifications, as Shyam Ranganathan points out. And then this denomination is used in order to contrast his philosophy from other major rival views like Advaita, non-dualist, Bheda, difference and non-difference, and Dvaita, dualist Vedanta. And this denomination also seeks to highlight Rāmānuja's effort to assert, I quote again Shyam Ranganathan, the unity of the many without giving up on the reality of distinct persons, qualities, universals, or aesthetics and moral values. I think I've been going on for too long now. I shouldn't. I'm sure people are very eager to listen to the main talk. So I'd like to, I think it's very, very interesting. It'll be very informative to hear today how Rāmānuja's metaphysics, which I have very badly summarized, can be understood from the Western approach of analytic philosophy. In this case, Panpsychism, which focuses on the mind and its existence in all entities, I believe, when probably much, much more than that. We are all eager to listen to you, Professor. So over to you, Professor Vaidya. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Sugalia.
ma'am.
That was
Thank you very
very
much
nice.
for your
I
wonderful
think,
talk.
Yeah, thank you. I think I would prefer to listen to you talk about Rāmānuja than myself, actually. I think that'd be very helpful for me. So let me just say a couple of things before I start. So it's a great honor to be part of this series because for someone like me who does, I don't consider myself a textualist at all. I don't write, read, or speak Sanskrit. I don't know Prakrit. I don't speak Hindi. I speak English and I understand a lot of Gujarati because I'm Gujarati. But other than that, my Indian language skills are 0 to none. So I'm not a textualist and I'm not an authoritative speaker of any language of the subcontinent. So I'm very honored that Srikala invited me to do this, but I don't want people to think like I'm like the premier example of someone who combines text, teacher, and tradition. So let me describe exactly what my goal has been for the past 12 years. My goal is to make sure that the ideas that are emanating from Indian philosophy can find themselves in the most contemporary debates in global philosophy. So my goal is very much centered on taking these ideas that I find in lots of different sources in Indian philosophy. Sometimes it comes from talking to a specific person like Arindam Chakrabarti or Jay Garfield, and then I'm like, okay, now I have an understanding of something. Let me try and put it somewhere else in philosophy and see how it goes. Other times it's from looking at my own ideas and research agendas and then going forward. So the point here I can summarize of what's going on is that, and also this is a very interesting talk to be giving a Sri Shankaracharya thing, because I'm kind of basically saying that there is a lot of attention already on Sankaracharya's contributions to consciousness in consciousness studies. There is far less understanding of the significance, for example, of another group of people I'm very interested in, Vedānta. I've been thinking about working on their stuff and Western theories of consciousness. So there's just a lot less attention about how those ideas would connect with the major themes in Western philosophy or global philosophy more generally. So my project has been slowly to pull attention away from people who think primarily that Indian philosophy is all and only Advaita Vedanta, because in the West, a lot of people don't even know what Advaita Vedanta is, but when they know what Indian philosophy is, it's Advaita Vedanta that's coming out of their ideology. So I really want to combat that. And I think that although I have deep appreciation for Advaita Vedanta, I personally don't think I am a subscriber to the letter of the law. So this talk is focused on an audience where, under the guidance of several other figures in global philosophy, such as Janardhan Ganeri, we have decided to put together an issue of a very prestigious journal in the West called The Monist that is going to focus on popularizing alternative traditions of Vedantic philosophy. Is there an echo? Oh, okay, good. It's gone. Good.
Please, Srinivasan Krishnamurthy. Yeah.
Yeah, please mute yourself so I don't have an echo. Okay, good. With that start, I will get into explaining what I think is going on, and hopefully Suganya can correct me with all the places I've gone wrong without the text. Okay, so let's go. Okay, good. So if I do this, can you see it? Can everybody see it?
Yeah, it's coming, Anand. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, so let's get started. So the first thing that we should talk about just is what is the terrain in theories of, so we're talking about consciousness. We're talking about this thing called phenomenal consciousness, which I'll get into in a little bit. But what are we basically talking about in terms of theories of consciousness? So analytic panpsychism is a contemporary branch of panpsychist research within the analytical tradition of Western philosophy. Now, basically, this movement of panpsychism, I think, finds its origin in, at latest, like people like William James and Bertrand Russell. I think that's perhaps the starting point or the point of departure for a lot of contemporary analytic philosophers that are panpsychists. They're looking at the work of William James and they're looking at the work of Bertrand Russell. And within Western philosophy, panpsychism literally means that psyche is everywhere. And depending on how you cut up the term psyche, you can have different understandings of what that means. So if you think of psyche in terms of like a soul, then it means soul is everywhere. And if you think of psyche in terms of mentality, then what happens is you get that mentality is everywhere. So one of the things that's going on in panpsychism in Western philosophy is something different that's going on in Indian philosophy. So I think oftentimes in Indian philosophy, what I've been told is that the problem is what is the relationship between chit and like a mind-body complex together. But the mind and the body together is already part of prakriti. So basically the idea is what is the relationship between chit and prakriti. And basically in Western philosophy, it's more like what is the relationship between mind and body. And so the idea that mentality is everywhere is something that might be understood differently in the Indian context. So one has to be careful about what they say when they talk about panpsychism, both in Western philosophy and in Indian philosophy. And also it's important to recognize that panpsychism itself in Western philosophy has a long tradition going back to ancient Greek philosophy and pre-Socratic philosophers. And it means different things at different times and different periods. And that's a very important thing. So we're just being kind of general here. So in the contemporary research, that is over the last 20 years, 30 years, there are two basic movements. So micropsychism is an atomistic approach to the metaphysics of consciousness. The constitutive version of it holds that facts about macro-conscious subjects. What is a macro-conscious subject? That's someone like you or me or a dolphin or a chimpanzee. So a macro-conscious subject, you and I, such as humans, are to be explained by and are constituted by fundamental microconscious entities. So the idea is like, just like there are protons and bosons and leptons, there are little small conscious like entities, and these things combine together in different ways, and that's how you get a macroconscious entity. So micropsychism is saying that in order to explain consciousness, we need to say that at the fundamental level, there is something itself that is already conscious. We don't have consciousness emerging from something that's completely non-conscious. We have consciousness emerging from something that is micro-conscious in relationship to other things. The way in which the wetness of water or the properties of water emerge from hydrogen coming into contact with oxygen in the right combination, we find that the same idea is going on when it comes to macro-conscious subjects. Macro-conscious subjects are explained in terms of micro-conscious things coming into combination with one another. So cosmopsychism is a monistic, non-atomistic approach, which basically wants to say that what's going on is not that there are a bunch of micro-conscious things that come into contact with one another, but that there's one unified cosmic consciousness. There's one unified monistic substance that's cosmically conscious. It's the whole unified conscious field. And then what happens is from that cosmic consciousness, we get individual macro-conscious subjects. So here the idea is we divide down from a conscious unified field to individual conscious things like you and I. And in the other one, in micropsychism, we combine up, okay? So we go from micro-conscious entities. The difference between micropsychism and cosmopsychism is basically that micropsychism doesn't really mean that everything is conscious. What it really means is that there are conscious things at the fundamental level. Cosmic consciousness, the cosmopsychism is closer to saying that at bottom, there is one cosmically conscious unified field. So consciousness is at the bottom, okay? Let's go. So both of these positions, this is completely independent of Indian philosophy. Both of these positions are within the analytic terrain. They have their independent problems. So the problem for micropsychism is what's known as the combination problem. And the idea there is, how do we get from micro-conscious entities to a macro-conscious subject? And the problem is pretty straightforward. If you think about perspectives, micro-conscious things each have a perspective because all conscious things have a perspective. So consciousness is perspectival. But the question is, how do two perspectives join together to form a unified perspective while keeping their own identity? And the problem is basically simply put like this. When you put a watch together with various different gears, you can tell apart those different gears from one another, even though they work in a system together to produce and check the time. But when you merge two conscious particles together that each have their own perspective, when you merge them together, a new perspective is formed, but they don't keep their independent perspective anymore. So the idea that things can combine and retain their own identity goes away, because what happens is that their identity merges to form a new thing. So it looks like in the combination problem, the issue is, how do you keep the identity of the things that merge together to produce a new thing? And the decombination problem is for cosmopsychism. And what the idea there is that how do you go from a coherent cosmic consciousness to individual conscious like me and Srikala and I are? How do we get our individual consciousness from each other in a way that's coherent? Like, how is it that if there's this one unified thing, part of my consciousness when it's divided down isn't also in Srikala's mind, and part of what's in Srikala's mind isn't also what's in my mind, okay? So the idea is, how do we divide down now? And basically, when you look at these problems, both of them, but in particular with the decombination one, that's what we're going to focus on. There's two kinds of problems here in the question itself. There's what we call a modal problem, and then there's a mechanical problem. So here's the modal problem. Is it genuinely possible for there to be macro conscious entities that are different from a cosmic consciousness while at the same time deriving their consciousness from the cosmic consciousness? So this problem is about plausibility, coherence. Does it even make sense? How is it that you can get separate individual minds from a cosmic consciousness when those consciousness for the separate minds derives from the cosmic consciousness? So that's a question about, is it even possible? Okay, that's a question about possibility. That's why it's a modal question. Now, there's another question, which is the mechanical question, and that is, if it is possible for there to be a derivation from a cosmic consciousness to a plurality of macro conscious subjects, how is that derivation actually carried out? What is the mechanism? So the first question is it possible to decombine? And the second question is, how do you decombine? Okay, those are the two questions. Okay, so we're not going to talk about micropsychism today at all. And we're not going to talk about the combination problem, because a lot of the issues that have to do with Indian philosophy are going to focus on cosmopsychism and the decombination problem. And now hopefully you'll see the connection very quickly. So within the schools of analytical philosophy of mind, there is one person who has done the most to try and bring Advaita Vedānta into contact with these debates in analytical philosophy. Her name is Miri al-Bahari, and she has written a couple of really nice papers on the way in which perennial philosophy, and she identifies Advaita Vedānta as one contributor to perennial philosophy, contributes to these debates. There are many Indian scholars who have written on consciousness in Western philosophy and in Indian philosophy. She's not alone in doing that. A lot of really excellent works on Advaita Vedānta and Western philosophy. But when it comes to the specific debate I am talking about, she is probably the person who has done the most in recent times. Like, this is contemporary research, articles being published just last year in the top journals in Western philosophy. So she's the leading person pushing this agenda. And what she says about solving the decombination problem is the following. She says the most promising way forward in the mind-body problem, navigating around all the problems to date, is to renounce the pervasive panpsychist supposition that fundamental consciousness must belong to a subject. This extends the reach and scope of consciousness to ground not merely the inner nature of the cosmos, but everything we take to be the world with its subjects and objects. So basically, her move in her big paper is basically to say that a lot of the debate over the decombination problem could be solved if we shifted our focus to the metaphysics of Advaita Vedānta. Okay, so her idea is there's already a solution to this problem in Western philosophy if we look at what's going on in the Advaita tradition. Now the question is, why does she believe that that's true? Here's why. So there are two issues. First, in Advaita, non-dual consciousness without a subject is fundamental and all that is real. So already in the Advaitic tradition, we have this idea of non-dual consciousness being what's fundamental and also being what's real. So one consequence of this for her is that the lack of a subject for fundamental consciousness is that fundamental consciousness is aperspectival, since perspectives attach to subjects and not to non-dual consciousness without a subject. So basically the idea here is that if you have something that is aperspectival and then you decombine down, then what happens is you don't have to worry about this aspects of how perspectives function with one another and how that functions in a way to solve the coherence or the incoherence of the decombination process, okay? The idea is that by making the fundamental thing not have a subject, just be a field, non-dual consciousness, but there's no subject of consciousness, then basically what happens is that thing becomes something that is aperspectival. And the aperspectival property, the fact that it's non-perspectival, allows it to do something in terms of grounding macro-conscious subjects in a way that's easier than when the cosmic consciousness has a subject also, okay? So, two positions. Cosmic consciousness has a subject. Cosmic consciousness doesn't have a subject. Her idea, in the Advaitic tradition, cosmic consciousness doesn't have a subject. That helps solve the decombination problem, okay? Second, all subjects of experience are perspectival and, as individual subjects, illusory. So what does this mean? So this is kind of one of these technical questions about Advaita that we'll probably get into in our discussion, because it always drives me crazy when this part comes up. But my understanding of the Advaita position is basically that the self, qua its individuality, is an illusion. Like, and I've talked to many Advaita scholars, and they all say different things to me and scream about some word in Sanskrit 100 times, and you're like, you're misunderstanding me. But at the end of the day, when I'm done arguing with them, I find that they really haven't convinced me at all that I'm wrong. They're just upset that this is how it sounds, and this is really the position. But if it turns out that really somehow subjects are real and the self is real in this way that is individualistic, and I'm just not getting it, please feel free to like correct me, and we can see where that goes. But basically the idea is this: if you take this position, then you have an aperspectival cosmic consciousness, and really the thing that you're trying to build up is something that's an illusion, not something that's real. So the project of recovering macro consciousness as something that's real is not as demanding, because all of a sudden what you're basically saying is that that thing is kind of an illusion. So what you need to do now is explain its illusoriness. You don't need to explain its reality. Okay, so that's basically the thing. Now, if as you all are kind of like familiar with, like, you know, where this is going, basically she's thinking, if you have this Advaita Vedānta position, you can solve a major problem in this Western debate about cosmopsychism, and you can actually make progress in the philosophy of mind in Western philosophy. Okay, so I just want to introduce this slide, which is sort of a tangent, but not really, because part of what I see going on that's a really important debate between Indian philosophy and Western philosophy is kind of comes from looking my own research and looking in Western philosophy and Indian philosophy and noticing something. So in Western philosophy, it's very common to discuss the nature of the self and the nature of consciousness separately. It's very common to see papers written about whether or not the self is an illusion or not that don't ever talk about the consciousness of a self or the consciousness of a subject. And it's very easy to find thousands of papers written about the nature of consciousness that don't really talk about the self anywhere at all. There, of course, there are some that do both, but there are lots that don't. So by thinking cross-culturally, what I've noticed is that it's useful to actually go back to the Indian tradition in global philosophy and talk about the self and consciousness together. So I've sort of generated a set of positions around a question that I think Western philosophers and Indian philosophers can jointly explore together. So the question is, which illusion, if any, should we accept? And there are various positions that, as you guys as Indian philosophers will probably recognize some of your favorite philosophers occupying. So one type of position is type C illusionism. The self is real, but consciousness is an illusion. Type S illusionism, consciousness is real, but the self is an illusion. Type D illusionism, the self and consciousness are an illusion. And type R realism, the self and consciousness are both real. So I'm trying to get this debate about which of these positions is the best position to occupy off of the ground. And I came to this this question by looking at Indian philosophy in relationship to debates in Western philosophy and thinking, why don't we redo the combination of debating self and consciousness together rather than separately? So in Indian philosophy, I typically find that every tradition that talks about the nature of consciousness has something to say about the self, and everyone that talks about the self has something to say about consciousness, pretty much. So they are always debating these two things together in a way that's very useful. And I find that world philosophy or global philosophy will be improved if we move in that direction. So this is why I'm talking about this here, because obviously I think, Sankaracharya and other Vedantins and other, Mimamsas and Charvakans, they're going to have different positions here on this map. And so the idea is, by taking this larger structure, we can include Western philosophy and Indian philosophy in a joint debate over a simple question. Which illusion, if any, should we accept? And if you're wondering what position I occupy, I am a type R realist. I think the self and consciousness are both real. And if you want to hear my talk on that another day, I can do that. Okay. So given this setup of what I've done now, like, what do I want to tell a Western audience about this wonderful person, Rāmānuja? What do I want to say is really great? So one thing is that he seems to be someone who has a way of providing Western philosophers with a way of understanding the diversity of Vedantic thought by moving beyond what is going on in Advaita. But importantly, I think his critique of Sankaracharya's Advaita, and maybe more than Sankaracharya, it attacks the mechanical component of the question. So I see Sankaracharya as using the concept of ignorance as a way of answering the mechanical decombination problem. I mean, so he doesn't seem to address this issue of whether or not it's possible to think about decombination. He probably assumes that that's the case, but he definitely goes for the mechanical question of, like, what is the way of generating individual centers of consciousness? How does that happen? And so I think he uses the concept of ignorance, and it's very clear that many people in the Vedantic tradition have noted that the use of ignorance by Advaitins is problematic, and Rāmānuja is one of them. And so that's very important. And so what I want the Western audiences to understand is that there's a rich debate between Advaitins and Viśiṣṭādvaitins on this issue of ignorance and ultimate metaphysics, and that debate can inform Western theories of consciousness, or a global, well, not Western, but just a global enterprise of understanding what consciousness is. So what I'm going to go through now is my presentation to a Western audience of what it is that he's pointing out and what is relevant about his critique. So again, how does this link up? It's very simple. There are two parts to the decombination problem. There's the modal and the mechanical. Shankara is arguing that the mechanical question is best explained by ignorance. And why are we talking about Shankara? Because Miri al-Bahari has claimed that, in fact, Advaitins move this non-dual consciousness. It's the way to go in order to solve the decombination problem. So the response argument that I'm giving is, yeah, but in order to solve the decombination problem, the modal aspect isn't important alone. The mechanical aspect is. And when you look at Shankara's response to the mechanical problem, and you look at it from Rāmānuja's perspective, you're going to see that there's a problem here, because Rāmānuja is going to point out that there's problems with the move to use ignorance. Okay. So he criticizes the use of ignorance in several ways. He says the very nature of avidya is riddled with contradictions. The description of avidya as inexplicable is untenable. No valid means of knowledge supports the Advaitin theory of avidya. The locus of avidya can be neither ultimate reality nor the soul. It is unintelligible to claim that avidya can obscure the nature of Brahman. The removal of avidya by right knowledge is untenable. The very conception of cessation of avidya is absurd. So he makes all of these criticisms. Now, for purposes of time, I don't have the ability to go through all of them. So I'm going to pick three, the ones that I like and I think are really easy to understand for a Western audience, because I was primarily thinking, how can I get them to understand what he's talking about? And so we're going to do that, and then you can see what the critique is. So the first one is called the locus problem. He says, ignorance requires a locus, since in the case of a person who's ignorant, there is a locus. So look, just think about it. You know, if I don't know something and Srikala knows that thing, and Srikala doesn't know something, but I know that thing, then the ignorance each of us have is located, one with her and one with me. So that's a very straightforward premise. That sounds true, actually. So either Brahman or a conscious finite self is the locus of ignorance, since there is nothing other than these in the Advaitin system. A conscious finite self cannot be the locus of ignorance, since it would have to come into existence at the same time as Brahman. A conscious finite self only comes into existence after Brahman is covered with ignorance. A conscious finite self is the consequence of Brahman's ignorance. Brahman cannot be the locus of ignorance, since self-luminosity is its nature, and ignorance and self-luminosity cannot exist in the same locus, just as light and darkness cannot exist in the same locus. So the Advaitic doctrine of ignorance is incoherent. I mean, this is just my cleaning up of an argument from Rāmānuja, but I mean, he seems to be making some good points, as I would say. Okay, contradictory nature of ignorance. He says, if ignorance is intelligible, then it is either real or unreal. If ignorance is real, then dualism follows, but Advaita is non-dualism about Brahman. In addition, if it is real, it exists for all times and cannot be destroyed. If ignorance is unreal, then it must be unreal as either the cognizer, the object which is cognized, the knowledge of the cognition. But it cannot be any of these, therefore ignorance is not intelligible. Okay, good, so going again. One more. Suppose objects are either real, unreal, or indescribable. To claim that an object fits under one of these categories is to claim that one can also know that it fits under one of these categories. Suppose ignorance is indescribable. It follows that there would be no way of knowing ignorance. Okay, so this argument that he gives, it's interesting because when I was doing some research on this, they said that the scholars were saying that part of the issue is that Sankaracharya and Rāmānuja won't agree on example of something that is known through the subject-object dichotomy that is real. So I think the argument that's being made here is, for the Advaitin, the Sankaracharya Advaitin style move, the idea is something like, look, if you know something through the subject-object dichotomy, because the subject-object dichotomy is duality and an illusion, what you know cannot be real. The only things that you can know that are real are going to come from a type of knowledge that doesn't involve the subject-object dichotomy. And so while Rāmānuja thinks you can know things through the subject-object dichotomy that they're real, Sankara doesn't. So it's kind of hard for them to debate each other on this point because they don't have the same view of what's going to count in the category. It's a difficult point. I'm not sure I understand exactly what Rāmānuja is saying, but he definitely makes this argument, and this was the example that the scholarship pointed to. Okay, so now let's move on. So basically, at this stage, what am I saying? I'm saying, okay, suppose you wanted to take this Advaitin move to solve the decombination problem in the mechanical version, then you should also accept the Advaitin theory of how the mechanism works. I mean, if you're going to use the Advaitin theory to solve the modal problem, then you should look at the Advaitin theory about the mechanical problem. And the Advaitin theory of the mechanical problem is the ignorance. But wait, Rāmānuja just said that whole theory doesn't make any sense. So now it looks like there's a problem with actually really taking Sankaracharya as the road to go down, as opposed to just this generalized idea about aperspectivalness in cosmic consciousness and at the level of humans. So now what I want to do is I want to put aside the Advaita, and I just want to go into the metaphysics. What is the view that Rāmānuja has? Okay, so roughly speaking, these are some of the main differences. I think probably there are more specific ways of saying this, but these are some of the main differences. There's a distinction between Brahman without attributes, Nirguna, and Brahman with attributes. Advaita only accepts Brahman without attributes as being real. Any attributes of Brahman are in appearance only. Viśiṣṭādvaita accepts Brahman with attributes. While Advaitins can make sense of attributes, they cannot do so in a way that renders them really real. So there is a way for an Advaitin to talk about those, but they're not going to be able to do it in a way that's really real. Both Advaita and Viśiṣṭādvaita hold that there is a primordial self. However, Advaita interprets the primordial self as non-dual consciousness. It holds that Brahman is non-dual consciousness. Viśiṣṭādvaita interprets the primordial self as the supreme person, Purushottama. It holds that Brahman is Vishnu Narayan, who has a body of matchless perfection. In classical Indian metaphysics, there's a distinction between a mode and the mode possessor. For example, the color of a rose and the rose that possesses the color. In Viśiṣṭādvaita, the kind of metaphysical dependence between a mode and its possessor is used to hold that the Supreme Person is strictly distinct from each conscious finite self and all non-conscious matter, even though they are inseparable from the Supreme Person. Advaita holds that Brahman is strictly identical to each finite self and does not make use of the distinction between a mode and its possessor. Another difference. Viśiṣṭādvaitins disagree with Advaitins over how the criterion for real should be used. For Advaitins, everything that passes in time is unreal/illusory. Impermanence is the mark of unreality. For Viśiṣṭādvaitins, impermanence does not entail unreality. For example, both material bodies and conscious finite selves are temporally bound and impermanent, qua material bodies and finite selves. Yet they are real and inhabit a different kind of reality than what the Supreme Person inhabits. So let me just say something here on this one distinction. What I find really attractive about Rāmānuja, at least in the understanding with all the conversations I've been having, is that there's some kind of move in his work towards the idea of multiple realities and different kinds of realities, as opposed to there's only one reality and the rest is all some kind of illusion. Or another version of it is that it's only real from its own perspective, but from the lower level perspective of Brahman, it's unreal and an illusion. So I think the Rāmānuja view is more interesting in these debates about consciousness because it's sort of getting at this idea of multiple kinds of reality. And that's actually very valuable too in contemporary research because a lot of people are looking for views that can accommodate some way of talking about multiple realities. This is really important right now for people who are interested in virtual reality, for example, with the computers. That's a very big move that people are starting to think about, is the difference between reality in one sense of being fundamental versus virtual realities, and what's the notion of reality that we're talking about in those cases. Okay, so I think Rāmānuja's metaphysics, unlike Shankaracharya's, goes in that direction. I think it goes closer in that direction, and that's why I'm interested in it. Okay, so at least on an understanding I got from a scholar at Cambridge, this seems to be one thing you can say about Rāmānuja theory. So material bodies are the lowest rank in his ontology. They have inner and outer transformation, but they are dependent on a finite self, the FS. Conscious finite selves occupy a middle level. Their essential nature does not change. However, the knowledge of any conscious finite self in its embodied state expands or contracts depending on its karma, and it's dependent on the Supreme Person. The Supreme Person has the highest rank. It's transcendent and immutable and non-dependent. So he has a graded ontology. There's hierarchies. And each of these things occupies its own reality in a sense, but they're not illusory. So this is one inference pattern that I think captures correctly what's going on between Rāmānuja and Sankaracharya. So Sankara accepts, and Rāmānuja denies the following inference. X is the ground of Y, so Y is unreal or illusory, but X is real. So let's just do that slowly. So the inference is X is the ground of Y, and now we infer from that, so Y is unreal or illusory, but X is real. This is a way of saying only those things that are fundamental are real. Anything else that's grounded in what's fundamental is unreal. Okay? So I believe the Sanskrit word here is adad, adaradeya. I believe that's the word that's being used in Sanskrit to talk about this notion of ground or support. So Rāmānuja does not hold that each conscious finite self is illusory qua finite self, and only the Supreme Person is real. Instead, Rāmānuja endorses the following inference pattern. X is the ground of Y, so Y is a different kind of reality and equally real to that of X, but not unreal or illusory. So this is, at least, I mean, for the life of me, it seems to me from reading stuff that Rāmānuja and Sankaracharya just do not have the same position about the nature of reality. And what I think is really important for debates on consciousness is actually this notion that I think Rāmānuja has. Now, if it turns out that Rāmānuja doesn't really have it, it doesn't really matter that much, because the idea is still actually very important. So the idea survives independently of what Rāmānuja's interpretation people come up with. But the thing is, for me, when I started looking at Rāmānuja in contradistinction to Sankaracharya, I started to see that, wow, this guy has a more world-affirming, a more realistic view that actually helps make sense of things. Okay. So we can do these inferences for Rāmānuja, and we can get each material body is grounded in its corresponding finite self, in the finite self's embodied state. Each finite self is grounded in the Supreme Person. So each material body has a different kind of reality than its corresponding finite self, but is equally real. And finite selves inhabit a different kind of reality than the Supreme Person, although they are equally real, right? So what we get is we get a graded thing, the body on the finite self on the Supreme Person. But instead of saying that only the Supreme Person is real and the rest of it is unreal, we get a view on which the other things are real. They're just real in a different way. That's the point. Okay, so Rāmānuja gives this argument. He says, the corresponding material body of a conscious finite self, that is the body, my material body, is a mode of the finite self in the sense that the finite self is a support, controller, and principle of its corresponding material body, which is its accessory. So my material body is the accessory of my conscious finite self, of which I am the controller. So then by analogy, he says, the material world is to the Supreme Person as a corresponding material body is to the conscious finite self. So the material world is a mode of the Supreme Person in the sense that the Supreme Person is the support, controller, and principle of the material world. So this is just a way of making sort of this analogy between what's going on with us and the relationship between the Supreme Person and the material world. Okay, so real quickly, I don't think I need the slide on, I do need the slide on the body. Okay, let's talk about the body. So Rāmānuja holds that body means any substance which a conscious being is capable of completely controlling and supporting for its own purposes. Thus, body refers not only to the material structure of a human being, but more broadly to any substantial entity, whether physical or not, that can be controlled and supported. As a consequence, the relation between the finite self and its material body is homologous to the relation between the Supreme Person and the material world, which is the body of the Supreme Person. The material body of a finite self is dependent on the finite self, just as a mode is dependent on the possessor of the mode. Thus, by analogy, the material world is a mode of the Supreme Person as its mode possessor. So I'm going to summarize two different aspects of this, the ontological and the teleological. A mode cannot be realized apart from its mode possessor. Thus, the material world is the manifestation of the Supreme Person, but cannot be realized without the Supreme Person. The Supreme Person is the material cause of the material world. Then the teleological. Just as an earring's nature is not fully explained without reference to an earring bearer, from whom and for whom earrings exist, the material world is not fully explained without reference to the Supreme Person, the possessor of the material world, as a mode of it, from whom and for whom the world exists. The Supreme Person is the efficient cause of the material world. Okay, so now I want to go back to the overall thing. So that was a little bit of the metaphysics and a little bit of the epistemology. So just recapping, part of the importance of Rāmānuja is that he critiques Shankara's use of ignorance, which in the contemporary framework would be used to solve the mechanical part of the decombination problem. Okay? So the argument was, if you want to accept Shankara's contribution to the modal part of the decombination problem, you should look at Shankara's answer to the mechanical component also. But the mechanical component doesn't make sense, so why not look at a different metaphysical picture? We look at Rāmānuja's metaphysical picture, and we see that Rāmānuja offers us a more realistic account of non-fundamental reality. So fundamental reality for Shankara and Rāmānuja might be different, but they both think it's real. And the difference is that Shankara has a different way of talking about different levels of reality. There's three of them for him. And basically, Rāmānuja has a different way of talking about it. And the realism that I find in Rāmānuja is the more attractive one, and that's why we're talking about it. Okay, so Shankara is an illusionist about the empirical self. His metaphysics avoids the modal decombination problem by eliminating the reality of subjects at both the fundamental and non-fundamental level. As a consequence, Shankara faces the mechanical decombination problem. How are illusory selves at the empirical level generated? He uses ignorance, but as has been argued here, that approach fails. Rāmānuja is a realist about the self. His metaphysics faces the modal version of the decombination problem by holding that the self at the empirical level is real. As a consequence, he must answer, how is it possible for finite conscious selves to be real and yet explained by superconsciousness? Okay, so good. So remember, so Miri is saying, if you take the Advaita thing, you get out of the modal decombination problem because the fundamental level of reality, which is just a field of consciousness, has no subjects. But Rāmānuja does not take that view. In fact, Rāmānuja is much closer to the analytic panpsychists who don't like this Advaitin move. So the analytic panpsychists think that cosmic consciousness has a subject, and they think individual selves like you and me have a subject also. And so basically they're saying we have to accept this assumption about subjects at both the macro conscious level and the cosmic conscious level. And the Advaitin direction pushes against both of those. So then there would be this idea that, you know, Indian philosophy just avoids this problem, but it doesn't engage with it. But that's not right if you look at Rāmānuja's work, because Rāmānuja seems to be holding the same assumptions, actually. And importantly, he also seems to be a realist in a really important way, which I like a lot. Okay, so now I'm just going to go through some parts of how I think Rāmānuja would deal with this problem from his own metaphysics, and then ultimately closing with my own views about some of this stuff. So a novel important feature of Rāmānuja's answer is the doctrine of the internal relation of inseparability, apratak-siddhi. It holds that each finite self is inseparable from Brahman because each one bears an adjectival relationship to Brahman rather than one of numerical identity. When an adjectival relation holds between two things, one is the possessor of the other, but the two are non-separable. Each finite self is inseparable from the Supreme Person, but nevertheless distinct from it, so that the imperfections of any given finite self don't affect the perfection of the Supreme Person. In virtue of the real distinction between the Supreme Person and each finite conscious self, there need not be any transparency between the Supreme Person and any finite conscious self. Individual finite conscious selves are real, separate, and the contents of their consciousness are not transparent to the Supreme Person. Rather, there is an organic unity between conscious finite selves and the Supreme Person. The notion of organic unity can be further explained through embodiment. It is important to note that even though Rāmānuja wants his view to not allow for imperfection to transfer from each finite self to the Supreme Person, who are adjectival modifications of it, there is a tension. How could the imperfections of the modifications not lead to an imperfection in the Supreme Person? Although Rāmānuja does not offer this answer, I think one can argue that there is a modal difference. The imperfections of each finite self are generically essential to it in the sense that finite selves are essentially imperfect in some way. However, no finite self is necessary for the Supreme Person, since each finite self contingently exists. Since Anita's imperfections are essential to her, but her existence is contingent for the Supreme Person, her imperfections are not part of the essence of the Supreme Person, who is essentially perfect. Actually, this slide is more about me responding to an objection, trying to defend Rāmānuja. We don't really actually need that one. Okay. Rāmānuja holds that each finite self is an attribute that is supported by the Supreme Person because each finite self is a mode of the Supreme Person who is the mode possessor. The relationship is asymmetric since the Supreme Person sustains and supports each finite self, but no finite self sustains the Supreme Person. Because the relation is one of sustaining as opposed to delimitation, we again get the result that it is not necessary that the Supreme Person has transparent access to the contents of any conscious finite self. While the Supreme Person provides consciousness, since it both is consciousness and has consciousness, it does not delimit, rather it sustains. In addition, the material world, which is constituted out of finite conscious selves and non-conscious material bodies, is not a spatial part of the Supreme Person. And I think the idea here that is really core is that the way in which support is understood here is not in terms of a spatial support. It's not like one brick holding up another brick. It's rather an enlivening in a sense of emanation. So it's a support of emanation, not a spatial support. So that's what I was trying to clear up for the Western audiences. It's not a spatial supporting relation. It's an emanation relation. Rather, it is a part in the sense of being possessed by the Supreme Person. Rāmānuja emphasizes embodiment as a relation between the Supreme Person and the material world. Each finite self is embodied in the Supreme Person. Embodiment makes the body an enlivening and sustaining support, for it is possible for X to support Y without Y being sustained by X. For Rāmānuja, the Supreme Person is not a support in the spatial locus sense. Rather, the Supreme Person is a sustainer of each finite self in an enlivening sense. Embodiment and inseparability explain the organic unity between the material world and the Supreme Person. Okay, so Rāmānuja's Viśiṣṭādvaita drops the assumption that everything is either fundamentally real or illusory. There are different kinds of reality, yet these different realities are equally real because they are all parts, in a non-spatial sense, of the Supreme Person in an organic unity. The Supreme Person is in a transcendent reality, while each conscious finite self is within temporal reality. Okay, so that's a list of overall. Skip this one. This is a list of summarizing all the differences and similarities between the two. Let me just go on to my concluding remarks here. So my ultimate view is that I can see that Miri al-Bahari is correct to hold that knowledge of non-dual consciousness must come from mystical experience, and that reports from mystics do provide a way for one to move around the modal decombination problem by providing evidence for non-dual consciousness. So a lot of what she is saying is that there is testimony of mystics telling us about non-dual conscious experiences, and that is a basis for thinking that it's possible, and then we can use that to solve the decombination problem. I completely agree with her, so I don't have a problem with taking the authority of mystics about the actuality of non-dual consciousness. I'm completely okay with that. However, I have a different view. In contrast to her Sankara Advaita inspired view, I hold that non-dual consciousness is simply one kind of consciousness. It is found in one kind of reality, which is non-dual reality. Arguably, non-dual reality cannot support intentionality, since intentionality is dual. Dual consciousness has a subject-object structure. It is suited for another kind of reality, a reality where intentionality, in addition to phenomenal experience, is found. So basically, I mean, the way I see things is that it's better to have the two distinct kind of reality views, because intentionality is really important. And the idea that intentionality is an illusion robs us of all meaning, because meaning, in fact, is intentional. So intentionality is really important. But if you have a non-dual fundamental universe, there's no intentionality in that, because intentionality requires directedness, requires subject-object structure. So there's two things there. I don't think you can explain intentionality in a pure phenomenal field that's non-dual, and I don't think intentionality makes any sense if it's fundamentally illusory. One can simply follow Rāmānuja and hold that there are two distinct kinds of realities, or three, maybe if you think there are three, where a complex relation holds between them. Furthermore, while it's logically possible for there to be consciousness without a self, it is metaphysically impossible for consciousness to exist without a self with respect to changes in knowledge. The primary reason for this is that epistemic possibility, the modality pertaining to knowledge, growth, and decay, has to do with what is possible for a subject to know, given what they already know. As a consequence, there must be a subject that can expand and contract with respect to knowledge. This subject must exist for longer than a durationless moment, since contraction and expansion of knowledge takes place for subject as one and the same over time. However, the subject need not be permanent in time. This last comment actually is more focused on the Buddhist views, because the Buddhist views claim that the self is impermanent. And as a consequence, I'm trying to respond to them by saying that you can't have a self that exists for a durationless moment, because that durationless moment won't allow for us to understand how knowledge can expand and contract for the subject. Okay. Finally, to hold that the individual self qua individual is an illusion, and the world that experiences an illusion is not acceptable to me. At least one reason is that this view requires a radical departure from ordinary metaphysics. It is a high revision of our ordinary understanding of the nature of reality embedded in the metaphysics of everyday objects. A revision of this kind is only justified given very strong evidence, something which I take to be lacking. So then some people will say to me, well, no, there's some really, really good evidence on it, and you're wrong. What's the evidence? Some might think that quantum field theory gives us reason to believe in an illusion about the material world we experience because it posits fields as fundamental and not, for example, material bodies. I'm skeptical as to whether the best interpretation of quantum field theory requires us to hold that the ordinary world we experience is an illusion because fields are all fundamental. Again, one can simply hold that there are different kinds of reality where both are equally real. Fundamentality need not force a graded view of levels of reality in all cases. So here the idea is that someone has to hold that all and only what is fundamental is real for them to draw the conclusion that because quantum fields are fundamental, everything else is an illusion, right? So there's two moves. One is, what is the things that are fundamental? And as many physicists tell us, are quantum fields. And so if quantum fields are what are fundamentally real, fundamental, then the question is, why are they the only things that are real? And that's because you think that if something is fundamental, it's all and only what is real. But that doesn't have to be true. There can be multiple levels of reality or multiple kinds of reality. And that is something I think Rāmānuja's theory opens us up to. Okay, finally, my skepticism about illusionism also derives from moral considerations. Illusionism about the ordinary world leads to a moral and existential outlook that is nihilistic. What is the point of existence of being moral if it is all an illusion? Illusionism neither existentially nor morally orienting. It brings out pure anxiety as to what our purpose could be. I believe it is better to hold that there are different kinds of realities because different kinds of reality provide us with the ground for moral orientation and navigation in a way that is lost under illusionism. So this general idea of trying to hold fundamental reality one way and then hold everything else to be an illusion, I think it's kind of nihilistic in a way. So my overall evaluation basically is that, hold on one second. My overall evaluation is that the theory that comes out of the Advaita school that Miri and other people seem to be moving towards might not actually be the best theory. And the reason why is because it isn't realistic enough, at least for the purposes I think you need realism for. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anand.
Oh, hold on. I think my camera is frozen. Let me turn it off and on again real quickly because I think it's frozen. Hold on. Good. Okay, better.
Perfect. No problems.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Anand, for that wonderful paper. Very analytic, very rigorous. And, we enjoyed it. And
Thank you.
over to Suganya to conduct the proceedings.
Okay.
Yeah, I think my video has frozen as well. It's come back, but it'll probably freeze all over again. Thank you so much, Professor Vaidya. That was so fascinating. And I'm so glad to know that you adhere more to Rāmānuja's view rather than somebody else's. And whatever you said, your views on illusionism like really are mine when dealing with, when reading about Advaita, for example. So thank you very much for that paper. I think we have a couple of minutes if anybody has any questions.
Can I ask one question?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Is there any empirical evidence for consciousness? And consciousness is a subjective phenomenon, so whether it can be explained by science, objective science, or philosophy.
So what was the question? Could you say the question again? I couldn't hear it.
Consciousness, is there any empirical evidence for consciousness? And consciousness is a subjective phenomenon, whether it can be explained by objective science or philosophy.
Sure. Is there any empirical evidence for consciousness? I don't know. You tell me. Are you conscious?
That I can say. But whether it is a subjective phenomenon, whether it can be explained by objective science or philosophy.
I think it can. I mean, do you think
Both.
so? I think that science and philosophy can explain subjective phenomena. Yeah, what's wrong with that?
It can be explained by philosophy more than science.
Both. I don't see opposition between science and philosophy and theology. I see working together.
Consciousness is subjective.
But why does that matter? I mean, if I want to go figure out what consciousness is, I'm going to talk to scientists, theologians, and philosophers at least, if not more people. I want to talk to all the smartest people who are thinking about this thing, and I want to work together on a team with all of them, because I think I alone am not smart enough to do it because it's such a big topic. How about that?
Is human brain quantum because it deals with free will and consciousness, which are subjective?
I don't know enough about whether our brain is a quantum computer or not. I don't know about that. I can't speak to that issue.
Roger Penrose has told about that.
I know, but I mean, Penrose says a lot of things. So what is the point? I mean, I'm not Penrose. I'm only Anand.
Yeah.
Okay.
I suppose, Suganya, go ahead with others. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the time is up, but maybe there's time for one other question or two. Anybody else would like to have to ask a question?
Suganya, I suppose, don't worry about the time, like we can have another,
Yeah, I have a little bit of time. So if you want to go over, I'm happy to talk.
Let's have the discussion. That is
Sure.
Swamiji, would you like to say something, Swamiji? Unmute yourself.
No. I enjoyed the talk, and a lot of things have been made clear to me which I didn't understand earlier. So really, I don't have any questions.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I may want to.
Please.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Please go.
Please.
It's not exactly related to Rāmānuja, but it's a general query.
Mm-hmm.
For example, let's take the example of time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, time seems to me is best appreciated as a subjective phenomena, because objectively speaking, it could be any other physical thing. Similarly, consciousness, it seems to me, insofar as its beauty lies as a concept that we appreciate, seems to me as a perspectival concept, insofar as it is a perspectival consciousness, concept of a conscious subject, that it has something different from other material concepts. But in itself, if we talk about a notion of a concept of consciousness which is completely non-perspectival, then it could be any other concept with a physical correlate altogether. I mean, what I'm trying to say is concepts like time or concepts like consciousness seem to me to have some special priority when they are seen as subjective phenomena, because in their location, or rather in their complete lack of location in perspectivality, in locating them in pure objectivity, they seem to lose something as though they could be any other scientific concept. Do you see what I'm saying here?
Sure. I mean, look, I mean, that consciousness is subjective in the sense of being, like, for example, had by subjects. Okay.
Right.
It's definitely something that's I mean, I definitely feel the pull of that position. So for me, the position that's harder to understand is non-dual consciousness, right? So that's that's the one where there are no subjects and there's consciousness. So there's a field of phenomenal stuff, blah blah blah, blahing around, and it's like doesn't make much sense to me. So the position that Rāmānuja has is the one where consciousness has a subject, and the one that Sankacharya has is the one where it doesn't have a subject. So I'm already on the position where it is had by a subject at all levels. That's just the kind of thing it is. So I don't myself understand notions of consciousness without subjectivity in it, in terms of there being a subject. However, I mean, it's one thing to say you can't understand it. It's another thing to tell a mystic that they aren't experiencing something real. So the position that I have is that testimony from mystics about non-dual consciousness is something we should take very seriously. We should not ignore that at all. We should take it very seriously in the study of consciousness, because it is an experience had by someone and they're testifying to its nature. So I don't want to exclude that. However, the fact that I am not excluding that and accepting it doesn't mean I have to accept that the only type of reality, which is the further conclusion being drawn here, is one that happens in non-dual consciousness, right? So I can say mystics are accessing a type of reality in which non-dual consciousness is experienced. And it's experienced in a manifestation way, not in a subject-object way, otherwise that'd be a contradiction. So non-dual consciousness is being experienced, but it doesn't mean that when someone has dual consciousness, like right now with intentionality, that is illusory. That's the point that I'm trying to make is about that relationship. It's about the relationship between what a mystic experiences in non-dual consciousness and what is the status of other types of conscious experiences. Are they real or are they illusory? And my answer would be to follow the line of Rāmānuja. But the fact that consciousness is subjective is something that I accept. I mean, but the earlier question was more about, can you study something subjective from the objective point of view? And this is actually something that John Searle at Berkeley dealt with a long time ago, because he disentangled the idea of ontologically subjective versus epistemologically subjective. So the way in which we know about consciousness in terms of empirical data is epistemologically subjective. I report the fact that I am having a conscious experience, just as the person asking the question before reports that fact. But that's the epistemic aspect. That doesn't make that what it is itself something that's ontologically subjective. So you can definitely tease apart things about the relationship between ontic and epistemic subjectivity in the nature of consciousness. But you're right. If you present an aperspectival notion of consciousness, someone might say, well, that's not something that I really understand or want to accept, because to me, consciousness loses its point when it becomes non-perspectival, because what consciousness is a subjective perspectival experience of something. And that would be correct. And a lot of philosophers in the Western tradition, like Edmund Husserl, would agree with that. They would say that that's exactly what's going on. So the idea for me is to link Rāmānuja as someone in the Indian tradition that also advances a view like this and has interesting things to say, as opposed to constantly going to Sankacharya because he has this other view about non-dual consciousness, which a lot of people also think is important. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Actually, some of my research that I'm doing right now for my doctoral is on the David Lewis's paper of de dicto and de se.
They say de
So
dicto.
that's de se, yes. So I was trying to come up from that. So anyway, thanks a lot.
But also just remember, like, the stuff about de se and de dicto also has a lot to do with location and also
That's right.
thoughts. But also one of the important things going on there is that nothing about Lewis's theory really talks about consciousness. When he talks about de dicto, we're talking about stuff about words, sentences, and propositions, and we're talking about de se. Yeah, so
that's a propositional attitude reports.
Right, exactly. He's not talking necessarily about consciousness. The argument about the relationship between perspectives and consciousness is a lot closer than the stuff about de dicto, de se.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
One last doubt is a materialist science growth in India was retarded by idealistic philosophy. Stay materialist science like physics, its growth in India was retarded by growth of idealistic philosophy.
Yes. Is that about? I'm not understanding. Is that a question, or are you just pointing that out? That sounds correct to me.
Did you understand my question?
Yeah, no, I don't understand. What's the question? Is the question, what is the question?
Materialist science like philosophy.
Let me help you, Santosh. So Anand, he is asking whether materialism did try to, put a stopper to the idealistic progress, or the other way around, is it? Is it that idealism prohibited the growth of materialism? Was that, Santosh, you were asking?
Yeah. I'm asking whether they. Yeah.
It's clear. Question is clear. Anand.
Yeah. I mean, historically, I don't know if they precluded one another, because oftentimes I think some of the people who work in the sciences, who we call as philosophers materialistic, they're just not engaged in philosophical questions. So Bertrand Russell is very different, obviously, but and so is William James. But a lot of people they don't think about these issues. So I'm not sure it prohibited anything. I do know one thing though, which is relevant to your question, which is recently the American philosopher Galen Strawson has made this very interesting point that links up with Sri Ramakrishna. And the question is, why do people think that it's so hard to explain consciousness? It seems like consciousness is not the hard thing to explain. It seems like what's hard to explain is what is matter. And actually, if you think about it, that actually kind of makes sense. It's really difficult to explain nowadays from quantum field theory what exactly is material, what is matter. That's like it's really hard to understand what the hell could really be going on. But conscious experience, I mean, like, yeah, it's hard to explain, but at least we have immediate access to it in some sense. So it seems like there's something different going on. Like the material world is becoming the harder thing to explain, while other kinds of things are easier and easier to explain, it seems like. So I do think that this has a connection to Ramakrishna, because one of my friends who's a scholar of Ramakrishna pointed out to me that Ramakrishna makes this point about the nature of mud. He talks about the fact that it's hard to explain what mud is, but consciousness might be easier. It's a very similar point to what Galen Strawson is actually talking about. So it's very interesting to me, that connection.
That's also Chomsky's position that it's matter that is harder to explain than mind or consciousness.
It's growing more popular now. It was stated a while back, but it's becoming quite popular now for people to point out after the Strawson article that really, you know, it might be the material world that's the harder thing to explain. And if you look at some of these works where the people are talking about the it from bit problem, where information is at the fundamental level of reality, and then the question is whether or not information carries mass, then you can see that the issue really is explaining the material world in some way.
Interesting.
Do they have a question, Pereira?
Yes, I wanted to ask. Can I ask a question?
Please
Because
go ahead.
I wanted to know if you have explored Jainism, because if the psyche is understood as soul, then Jainism believes that even matter has soul. So can Jainism, the philosophy of Jainism, be compared to Panpsychism?
Yeah, so I have looked at that. I have, and I am working. I don't. Right now, there's so much stuff where I'm still trying to figure out. The next one for me is actually to work on Abheda. I think actually that's the one that actually needs more attention. I have worked on the Jainism one a bit, but the answer to the Jainism one is that here's a quick line that I've heard. This is the one that I see people talking about a lot. So Leibniz was a rationalist philosopher, a German philosopher, and basically he argued for something called monadology, where there are various monads and a plurality of monads. So while Descartes is a substance dualist and Spinoza a substance monist, Leibniz is a substance pluralist, and monads are these little things. I have seen people compare Jain philosophy of consciousness to Leibniz's monadology. That's what I have seen done. Now, whether or not that is a correct line-by-line comparison, I think it's not. I think it's very different exactly what a monad is and how exactly in Jainism the understanding of everything having a soul is supposed to be understood exactly. So you might want to look there, but I think that Jainism obviously. So another thing is that Jainism might look more like micropsychism. Actually, this is another idea I came up with one time, is that Jainism is not a form of cosmopsychism, because it's not saying that there's one unified field. So you notice that what Rāmānuja and Sankaracharya have in common with the cosmopsychists is that they do think there is this one thing. Of course, it's Vishnu Narayan, as I understand it, in the case of Rāmānuja, and it's Brahman with no subject of consciousness in Sankaracharya. So there's that difference. But the Jain view, it might be the case that the Jain view is actually a micropsychist view, because it's not saying literally that there's one unified field. It's saying there's consciousness, little conscious things in everything, right? So remember, the difference between positing a plurality of atomistic souls everywhere, that's one move. And then the other thing is positing one unified thing of which everything is a part. So those are the two different things. So you have to be careful about the actual metaphysical structure of what someone is talking about. You need to get into the metaphysics and understand what exactly is going on and be very careful when you're looking at it. So you have to look at carefully at what monadology, what monads are, and how they relate to the kinds of things. But I would think it's actually, last time I was trying to figure this out for Jainism, I thought it was closer to a micropsychist view. Like it's a micropsychist, panpsychist view.
Thank you, sir.
If there is no one else, so can I ask a couple of questions to Anand?
Well, I have a question.
No, I was asking Suganya, can I have a chance to discuss with Anand?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
That's
I was just, I mean, if it, no, there are no other questions, that I was just curious. You mentioned William James and Bertrand Russell, right? As the developers of this Panpsychism, right? Any chance they've read anything by a Vedantin, and if so, would that be just Advaitic stuff?
Well, okay, so a couple of things here first. First, I don't think that analytic panpsychism, I don't think that either William James or Bertrand Russell are actually the forerunners of it. No, but you're right. I did say that. I think the contemporary people, they go back and look primarily at Bertrand Russell and William James, but they're building off of them. And also, I've discovered now that there are a bunch of American philosophers after William James who developed panpsychism in American philosophy in a different way as well. So William James, I think it's likely that he actually was aware of some Indian philosophy and probably took it to heart. I mean, some of the passages that he writes, I mean, like when I read it, I'm just like, okay, man, you read some, you read some Vedānta. We also know that they all read Schopenhauer, and we know that Schopenhauer read a bunch of Indian philosophy. So it's not that hard to think that by way of understanding Schopenhauer and his book, The World as Will and Representation, that they basically had some access to Indian philosophy. But it's already clear that within Western philosophy, there is panpsychism stretching all the way back to the pre-Socratics. So it's not like they needed to borrow the idea from Indian philosophers in order to go somewhere with it. It ran out of fashion for a long time because people thought it was a little bit weird to say that rocks are conscious. But now that's not a hard thing to talk about. That's like when someone says like, well, panpsychism is false because rocks aren't conscious, you can just point out, well, rocks lack subjectivity, but they might be conscious. So there's lots of ways to talk about this problem now. But I think maybe the influence of Indian philosophy is found in some of the later people, but of the people that are right now popular in terms of pushing panpsychism, the main figures, they don't actually talk about Indian philosophy at all. It's pretty much me talking to them and saying, hey, I think like, and Miri also, but Miri's orientation is very, very Advaitic. I mean, she talks about perennial philosophy in a way that's global, but her contribution from Indian philosophy is pretty much to push everyone in the Advaitic direction. And I think that there's a good amount of work that can be done in various, like post-Shankara and Advaita and various type of things. But for me, it's really important to look at these other schools because they have ideas that help other philosophy traditions understand that realism is actually found in Indian philosophy. This is a big problem, as I see it, is that the standard sort of view is some kind of hybrid Sankhya Vedanta stuff that's basically highly illusory about a lot of stuff. And that sort of doesn't work that well when a lot of people still are thinking there's a connection between moral orientation and realism.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to add something.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm basically a philologist who's working on philosophical texts. So I'm not a philosopher, but I deal with philosophy every day. So my understanding of things is not always up to the mark. But I'm reading these texts about Viśiṣṭādvaita, and yesterday I was listening to one of the Jia Swami's talks, and he was explaining that even achits, meaning a book, for example, has a soul inside, and within that soul enters God. So you see, that sort of, whatever you said just now, echoed, made sense to me today, I think. So yeah. Because I didn't realize that at all. I just thought, well, achit is matter, and that's it.
So I think later on at some point you and I should exchange email and discuss more, because I think a lot of the textual sources that I might need to look at for the next paper I'm writing on Rāmānuja, I could probably get a lot of help from you. So if you don't mind, if I could reach out to you for help, I'd really appreciate that, because I'm not an expert in this, and
Please do.
So Kenya, before we close, I'll just have a quick discussion with Anand.
Okay.
on, of course, it is philosophy. In Anand, the major argument seems to be that Panpsychism gels, Rāmānuja's metaphysics gels better with Panpsychism because anyway, the ignorance, or what we technically call the Vidya Maya, fails. This is your argument. Fails,
That's
and then,
part of it. Yep, that's part of it.
and the major arguments, you have quoted that 7 Anupapatis, Ashraya Anupapati, Tirodha Anupapati, and all that. Sarupa Anupapati, Anurvachani Anupapati, all that. And of course, you have did it in English. That is the only difference. And my contention is that, remember, later Advaitins have well answered to Rāmānuja's this very famous criticism. My professor R. Balasubramanian used to say that there is no one who has understood Shankara as good as Rāmānuja, because Rāmānuja has finished whatever the later Viśiṣṭādvaitins or Advaitins have criticized, or even the Purva Paksha Advaitins themselves. We presuppose the arguments that could come forth, and all that could have been summarized in this Sapta Anupapati. Having said all this, my appeal to you, Anand, is that these two attempts, the two metaphysics, are in some way parallel, in the sense that Advaitin, the phenomenological understanding, phenomenology in the sense, of course, you spoke about intentionality, wherein whenever you speak about phenomenological method, we are obsessed with the intentionality. There has to be consciousness, has to have the object on the other side, and the Dharma Bhuta Jnana, which Viśiṣṭādvaita speaks about, Sri Rāmānuja speaks about, the Dharma Bhuta Jnana speaks about the pure intentional consciousness, where you ought to have a object with related to the consciousness. And that is why it seems non-problematic. But remember, quite like Husserl, what Advaitins speak about is kind of pure consciousness, wherein there is this possibility of pure consciousness enjoying, experiencing itself without the help of the object. And there is ample support for the claim in the text. For instance, Bhagavad Gita says, Atmanyeva Atmana Tushtaha. Just yesterday we had a chat, myself and Professor Arindam. He was talking about Kama Gita. And then so I was saying that, the phenomenal being consistently, progressively getting disinclined from the phenomenal objects, rolls back and then comes back to itself, and then finds happiness with the self, where there is zero material object. And as Gitakara says, Lord Krishna says, he is happy with himself. So consciousness doesn't necessarily need an object, is the claim, the primary claim in Advaita metaphysics. So if you don't appreciate it, and also that perspective, I think whoever has said that hasn't understood Advaita Vedānta. It's not, it's purely philosophical. And when you understand Rāmānuja, I think, Suganya is an expert in Rāmānuja. Of course, Anand, you are also. My understanding of Rāmānuja is basically a theistic philosopher. He is trying to say the avayavi sambandha between the world, soul, and God, because God is so merciful. And that is the point that he wants to underline. I think that is not the metaphysics part of it, as we philosophers, we are technically getting attached to it. He is a lot pragmatic. So he is all worried about how Lord could come down and help the human beings, which Shankara is apparently, according to Rāmānuja. Of course, I don't agree with Rāmānuja primarily, but that's different. You have God, you have Ishvara. He is handy for people who are confined to the phenomenal. But Rāmānuja's concern is poor human souls, and he wants to make them as avayavas, the limbs of God, so that they have an ontological recognition, acceptance, and then be part of the absolute. So I think these are two parallel streams where de-promoting or de-recognizing one in terms of the other might not help. And also quickly, another thing is moral nihilism. Advaita, you claim that Advaita supports moral nihilism, where, please, I think I'm reminded of Sureshwara's Naishkarmya Siddhi, where he says, of course, none of us are Jivan Muktas, but the theory is that Jivan Mukta is, for instance, you don't have to speak moral discourses to Jivan Mukta. He says the analogy given us, the fire, you cannot attribute any dirt to the fire. Quite like a burning fire, the Jivan Mukta will not have any immoral factors in it. So morality is not, a taught morality, but natural morality. That is why I always claim that in Indian philosophy, that's not only in Advaita, everywhere, metaphysics and ethics have been considered as one single science. There is no division. Yes, there are a couple of things also, but then you can go ahead responding to me. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So the first point about the parallel, it's interesting because I thought you were going to make the parallel claim in a different place. So so the point that I was pushing on, like the stuff about, so let me explain the story. Like, of course, Advaitins have responses to Rāmānuja's 7 worries about ignorance. Of course they do. Otherwise, they wouldn't have existed afterwards. So of course they do. So I'm totally aware of that. But Srikala, now what you're doing is you're not taking the audience. Like, look, the amount of stuff that is out there in global philosophy coming from India that's either on Buddhism or Advaita is extremely high. Who the hell orients anything about non-illusory theories in Indian philosophy? Hardly anybody knows about Nyaya at all. I am simply trying to promote the idea that there are realist schools in Indian philosophy with smart thinkers with good arguments. Now, the fact that Advaitins have responses to Rāmānuja's 7 problems doesn't mean that those aren't really good arguments. In fact, the one about the locus of ignorance is a pretty damn good argument for me. As far as I'm concerned, I'm pretty much convinced by that one alone. I mean, forget about the one about anarvachaniya. I mean, but look, I read a whole book that was an exchange about this stuff. Mm-hmm. It's pretty in-depth. If we can get philosophers and other traditions to be like, hey, this is interesting stuff, I kind of want to know what's going on here, because Indians think about ignorance in a very different way than Europeans do. Avidya is a very interesting concept. Let's think about it. That's the direction I'm going. So you're right, he's more theistic, but again, his theism also has something metaphysical that's really important. He is a sustaining relationship in an embodied and emanation sense. He is not in a spatial support sense. So it's very important to point out that metaphysical component of what he's doing. The theism that you talked about is absolutely correct. Everyone has pointed this out to me. And they actually always say to me, they're like, it's interesting how you don't talk about the theistic components of this one philosopher who's so theistic. And I'm like, well, that's because the other stuff he said is also interesting. So I'm coming at it in terms of what I think is interesting. But the one thing that you didn't say about my argument that I thought you were going to say, which is the parallelness, which has been pointed out to me, is that in fact, if you take the Advaitin distinction between the Paramarthika, the Vaivaharika, then you basically can say this is a constant argument. Sankacharya is a relative realist and Rāmānuja is a real realist. This is the new argument that I see people making. So they're like, wait a minute, the self isn't an illusion for Sankacharya. No, it's just that from the perspective of Brahman, who doesn't have any time under which it will be sublated, it's true that this thing is an illusion. But from its own perspective, it's not an illusion. It's the only thing in the Paramarthika or the Vaivaharika. It depends what level you're at. So why are you saying that the self is an illusion? This is an incorrect understanding of it. I've had very esteemed scholars of Advaita tell me that that their reading is the right reading, and that it's wrong to say that he's an illusionist. Actually, he's not an illusionist. He's a relative realist. This is kind of the position. So I accept that. If that's the criticism that someone wants to make, I still think this. I still think that this is the correct. Rāmānuja is a real realist. He's not doing any relativity at all. He's basically saying if you take the adjectival relationship of apratak siddhi and you link everyone in this way as many limbs, the reality of the one is the same kind of reality over here. It just has a different dimension to it. Its temporality is bounded for a finite conscious self, while the temporality is unbounded for the Supreme Person. And I think that the real realism of Rāmānuja to me, but there is a way in which they're parallel, if you look at it this way, because they're parallel in terms of both being realists of a certain kind. It's just that Rāmānuja is more theistic, as you were pointing out correctly, and Sankaracharya is less theistic, and that's because of the way in which it makes the attributes of God and His mercy real things that we experience. So yeah, I think so. What about but the second one? Let me say something about the second one. So I think I might have misspoke. So I don't think that Advaita Vedanta is a theory that does not have a moral outlook tied to its metaphysics. I think that you're correct about that. What I'm saying is that for me, as a global philosopher, thinking about multiple philosophical traditions, illusionism doesn't fit well with moral orientation. I don't see how that works. And I don't see the argument about how it is that you tell me, and then, so this is the way you back off. So if you're like one of these Advaitins, you're like, no, it's because you think Sankaracharya is promoting illusionism. But no, he's a relative realist. Because he's a relative realist, there is no moral nihilism. And I'm like, oh, okay, maybe not, but why not just be a real realist and get rid of the moral nihilism altogether? So it's kind of, but you are right. I mean, is there a way in which the Advaitins can come back? I would hope so. They're really smart. You know, like I said, like, I mean, I'm not sure that they're good. But the thing is, I think my final comment is this. Even if Advaita has got all these great moves, we need more people to learn about other Indian philosophical traditions. I'm sorry, but the amount of people that don't understand that realism is to be found in Indian philosophy is very high. And I'm trying my best to sort of change that way of looking at things.
Anand, actually, I'm a huge fan of Viśiṣṭādvaita. If you look at, the recent talks that I have given, most of them are on Viśiṣṭādvaita for two reasons. Primarily, Advaita is a little hard to get across, because it's purely philosophical. And the other is more human because, we human beings, and then there is a theistic God, and basically, primarily very theistic person. So that also gels with the Viśiṣṭādvaita position. Fine. And yet another complaint that I have is, in this deductive argument, where you are saying that X is the ground for Y, then Y can be illusory is something which is acceptable for Shankara, but not acceptable for Rāmānuja. That's okay. But, X is the ground, that is, Brahman is the ground for, that is what you have in mind. Brahman is the ground for Maya, then Maya can be illusory. That's what I'm saying. But, we have to be very careful here because Brahman is not the ground. He is not Karana. There is no Karya-Karana Sambandha here. Brahman is not the real cause. It is apparent. Apparently the Brahman becomes the cause of Maya. There is no Karya-Karana Sambandha here. Unlike other reasons. See, that is why, Advaita takes a purely philosophical outlook. And if you don't wear that specs of philosophy, well, you'll not appreciate Advaita. And
so you don't think that so there's no relationship between Brahman and anything causally?
That is their theory. It is not causal in the sense that the causal relation, according to Advaita Vedānta, the causal relation is applicable only at the vyavaharical, at the absolute level. That is what Madhyamakas also hold.
And also, that's right, but but maybe, so part of the problem here is that the word ground doesn't have to mean causation only. It can also mean that which explains. So there's an explanatory role that's non-causal. So in English, at least, we work on the word that way. Look, some of this has to do with what the word...
Accounts for is fine. Yeah, Brahman accounts for.
Yeah.
Explanatory, that's what you're saying. That's fine. Yeah, if that is what you meant, then it is fine. But then we should understand that that is one of the criticisms. And very often quickly, Advaitins would say that, but you haven't understood. But not to Rāmānuja. Not to Rāmānuja, okay, because as I repeat what Professor R. Balasubramanian says, there is no one on earth who has understood Shankara as best as Rāmānuja. That I repeat 1,000 times. So thank you so much. Over to Suganya.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. I hope to be in contact with you, Suganya, and talk about. Thank you for your help. I really want to learn.
You want to be in contact with me, Anand?
Yeah, I will. I will. We can do another session where I can learn. I need to learn from everybody.
I'm Rāmānuja that you're disowning me, is it?
No, I'm not disowning you. I just need to learn some Rāmānuja. Don't worry, I'm coming back to Kerala soon.
Yes, Vaidya. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anand. Any other questions? Any other remarks from anybody else?
Actually, according to science, where is mind? Okay, where is mind? According to philosophy, where is mind?
Sorry, we couldn't hear you very well.
According to science, where is mind located?
Oh. So, well, look. So at least really quickly, I can say the following. I'm very much into the extended mind hypothesis. So my view is that basically the mind does not have to be co-located where the brain is. So I definitely don't think that so can the mind be co-located and contemporaneous where the brain of a person is located? Yes. Is it necessary? No.
Thank you.
Please, Vaidya.
Yes. Okay. So thank you so much, Professor Vaidya. It was super interesting, and let's hope to hear from you once again. So, and thank you everybody who has been present here. Thank you, Srikalaji, for organizing this.
Thank you.
Let's call it a night then, and call it a day for you. I don't know.
Wait a minute, there is a formal Urdu.
Oh yes, there is Dr. Shiba, I think.
Dr. Shiba. Dr. Shiba, please come over. Put on your.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening to one and all. Honorable Vice Chancellor Dr. Dharmaraj sir, today's speaker Professor Anand Jayaprakash Vaidya, Revered Sri Hariprasad Swamiji, our moderator Dr. Sukanya Anandakrishnan, Professor Sri Kalayam Nair, Director of ISSS, my dear students and senior professors from various parts of the globe, and dear colleagues and my dear students. The International School for Sri Shankaracharya Studies feels so proud to have launched two remarkable events, the new website of ISSS and the prestigious International Lecture Series on Teacher, Text and the Tradition, Indian Philosophical Heritage. It is a matter of great pride and pleasure for me to propose official vote of thanks to the distinguished scholars and to the august audience. First of all, I would like to express our sincere thanks to Honorable Vice Chancellor Professor Dharmaraj sir, who always supports and encourages us to undertake such type of academic activities. On behalf of International School for Sri Shankaracharya Studies, I express our sincere gratitude to Honorable Vice Chancellor sir for officially inaugurating the new website of ISSS and the International Lecture Series. Thank you very much, sir. Now, it is my pleasure to express our sincere thanks to Professor Anand Jayaprakash Vaidya for the detailed explanation of the new metaphysics of consciousness, that is analytical Panpsychism, and the metaphysics of Rāmānuja's Viśiṣṭādvaita Vedānta, especially highlighting the differences between Advaita and Viśiṣṭādvaita. Thank you very much, sir, for the brilliant presentation. Let me express our sincere pranams and gratitude to Revered Hariprasad Swamiji for blessing us. Pranams, Swamiji. Now, I would like to thank today's moderator, Dr. Sukanya Anandakrishnan, for chairing this academic event and for the introductory remarks. Thank you, ma'am. I am also grateful to Professor Sri Kalayam Nair, the vibrant and enthusiastic director of International School for Sri Shankaracharya Studies, for her welcome address. Thank you, ma'am. I would like to express our thanks to the IT team of our university for designing the website. Thank you, Rahul and his team. Thanks to all. I extend my sincere thanks to all the senior professors, scholars, my colleagues, and my dear students for making this event a grand success. Thank you all once again. I thank all.
Thank you
ma'am.
all. Thank you, Shiva. And before we close, those senior professors who are here, please join our study circle. It's very, very interesting because we read the text. This month and on 30th, we read Sri Bhashya by none other than Alwal, the son of great Tatacharya. So we'll get to know, to frankly speak, I am reading Brahma Sutra Bhashya after a long time. Because, so is the case with Sri Bhashya. Because we have all the texts in and around, and we read only those texts which we have to teach. So it's an opportunity for us, elders, as well as in the name of youngsters, we also start reading the text. So it's very important. So join us if time permits. So thank you all. Good night. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.